Good morning, everybody. It is 8 o'clock on the dot. So we have a very packed agenda today. So I think it will be worth kicking off straight away with some housekeeping elements. So I will begin with that. First of all, I will share my screen. Now, can everybody see the screen okay? Someone give me a thumbs up. Great, perfect. So, good morning and welcome to the Gender Equality Attitudes Study webinar. Thank you all for joining. I should say it's good morning, good afternoon and good evening, as we have members from all different corners of the world. So my name is Ellie Einson and I am the Strategic Communications Consultant for the Unstereotype Alliance. So I would like to take you through the order of today's webinar before I hand over to Dan. So today we will have a presentation of the key findings from the 10-country pilot study into attitudes towards gender equality. Following that, our panelists will discuss the importance of this research and the relevance to the advertising and marketing industry. They will explore the value of nuanced data and discuss the implications of COVID-19 on gender equality. And then in the last 10 minutes of the webinar, we'll have a dedicated Q&A section. So we ask that all of your questions are put into the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom. I will monitor that throughout the webinar and save all of those questions for the last 10 minutes. So feel free to pop your questions into that chat box at any time, but just to let you know, it won't be until the last 10 minutes that we will come to answer those. So before I pass on to Dan to open the session, I just wanted to introduce our fantastic panelists today. So from Kantar, we have Dr. Michelle Harrison, who is CEO of the Public Division at Kantar. Michelle works with governments, multilateral governmental bodies, and international development organisations in all aspects of public policy, political advisory, and public affairs. Recently, with women political leaders, she launched the Reykjavik Index for Leadership, which is the first international measure of how women are perceived in terms of leadership. Also from Kantar, we have Rosie Hawkins. Rosie is the Chief Offer and Innovation Officer from the Insights Division at Kantar. Rosie leads the offer and strategy development and is responsible for continual evolution of new data streams, as well as original research that will deepen our understanding of the human condition. Over the past few years, her work has included a focus on diversity and inclusion to ensure Kantar's work supports the creation of a fairer society. From the Unstereotype Alliance, we have Sara Denby, who heads up the Secretariat. Before joining UN Women, Sara was head of campaigns and communications for Care International in Australia. She worked on gender equality programs and advocacy strategies for Australia and Cambodia, and for offices across Asia Pacific. Prior to that, she spent 18 years in the advertising industry. And our final panelist, and by no means least, is Dan Seymour, who is the Director of the Strategic Partnerships of UN Women. Dan previously served as UN Women's Director of Humanitarian Action and Crisis Response and Strategic Planning Advisor to the Executive Director. He joined the United Nations with UNICEF in 2002, working in the Child Protection section of Programme Division and as Chief of UNICEF's Gender and Rights Unit. In 2010, he moved to UN Women to support its establishment. So I would now like to pass on to Dan, who will begin the session with some opening remarks.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Ellie, and welcome everybody. I'll try to be brief because I think we want to get on to the action, which is to hear about the study, but I have to say a few things to get us underway. Really very, very happy to see this event today, as I know many of us are across the Unstereotype Alliance and more broadly. We had a sort of preview of some of the initial conclusions back at Cannes. Last time we had a Cannes where we came together physically, but this is now our opportunity to go really deep on this. I think we all are part of this discussion, part of this collective effort, because we share a belief in the importance of stereotypes, norms, of attitude and behavior, and what they mean for equality. And I think for some time, one of the biggest challenges we've faced in tackling this is a really nuanced and evidence-based understanding of what exactly the attitudes are that we need to tackle and change. We have an impressionistic sense of that, but we haven't always had as much data so that we can drive our efforts on a foundation of evidence. So this study is really here to get a sense of what kind of attitudes we're talking about, what the scale of them are, help people understand that, and help us tackle them. It's really an essential prerequisite for us being effective in our collective efforts. The study was designed to get a sense of what the sentiment is, to go down to the country level, to go down to specific demographics, and really give us that nuanced picture that will allow us to work together. So I think, you know, you're going to see a lot of information that's not just interesting, it's actually really valuable, and it gives a reality and an orientation to the work that we're doing that we never really had to the same extent. What we're talking about here is the first wave of the study. That's 10 countries. And as I'm sure most of you know, we were very deliberate in not picking any particular type of country. It's quite a diverse group of countries. But even more exciting to see that now we're in 2020 going into the second wave. You'll hear a very, very sneaky preview of that now, but more later. And the expansion to 20 is part of an overall ambition that we have to keep expanding. And there you'll see the diversity of countries across the world, different sorts of cultures, different sorts of income level, and so on. So this is really giving us a sense of what people think in a really wide range of contexts. We kind of wish we were telling you more about 2020 now. I think everybody understands these are times when all of our plans have had to take a little bit of a back seat for a while with other things. And a lot of stuff we were wanting to do is a lot harder to do than we anticipated it being. But we're making progress on that and really looking forward to talking to you about it. The last thing I really wanted to say is of course, the thank yous. I am particularly grateful to Kantar, who've led this, to Lynette, who's not here, Rosie, Michelle, all the colleagues there, not just for the presentations that they've done like today, but working with them on making this happen. It's been really, really wonderful working with them, and we owe them a lot of thanks. Also, many of the colleagues within UN Women, Patricia and others, who've worked very hard on this. It's greatly appreciated. But in particular, of course, I have to recognize our sponsors, AT&T, Johnson & Johnson, Kantar, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever, for just the vision, I think, of investing in this exercise. I think there's a lot of people across the marketing communications industry, whether they're advertisers or agencies, wherever they sit, who talk a lot about their commitment to this. But I think to have the vision to appreciate the importance of a study like this for our collective efforts and the willingness to put resources behind it, that's an additional step. So we really are very grateful for that and want to acknowledge that. And of course, you see the 20 countries there on the screen for 2020. We would love them to be 40 for 2022. So any of you who are interested in maybe becoming a sponsor as well for this exercise, please do let us know. So I would like to just hand over to Rosie and look forward myself as well to hearing more about this, because I love it every time I hear it. So over to you, Rosie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. And I should add that at Kantar, we are immensely proud to be part of this team and to be able to present some of the learnings to you today on this study. I'm going to dive right in. The study covers 9 theme areas, and in each we explore the extent to which women have equal rights to men. Before we dive into these individually, I want to have a look at an overall level and to see and to say that we have overwhelmingly strong consensus that gender equality is important for future success. And so you see some of the stats here. We have 91% of people believe that respect for women's rights in all areas is important to the country's success. It's as high as 97% in the UAE, in Colombia, and in the Philippines. And the lowest score, which still represents 3/4 of people, is in Japan. So strong understanding that gender equality is important. 84% believe that it's essential to treat women as equals to men, and 91% believe in equal pay for equal work. And so I think what we see here is the opportunity. We see gender equality as a key condition to a country's future. And while this should absolutely give us hope, it's also why information, attitudinal data of this sort is so important. This study, as you've already heard, was set up to shed light on the existence and the magnitude of the underlying and harmful gender stereotypes that reveal, frankly, how far away we are from this gender equality, and to identify the barriers that will continue to block our progress towards a fairer society unless we continue to take decisive and progressive action. And this conversation is only more important because of the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, in the midst of a global pandemic. We're seeing governments, societies, and people around the world being tested and having their values tested and exposed in ways that they perhaps haven't done before. And we'll talk a little bit about the COVID-19 context later on in the presentation. But against this backdrop of overwhelming consensus, what do we see within some of these specific theme areas? We do see disparity between men and women's rights at an overall level. Over on the left-hand side, we see less discrimination in healthcare and in education. And as we move gradually towards the right, we see greater disparity between men and women, and particularly in the area of leadership and participation. Briefly on healthcare and education, these are both areas where the country differences are more marked than the gender differences. So we do see quite stark variation in access to healthcare, for example. In Colombia, Nigeria, and Kenya, we have particularly low levels of access for both men and women. So it's the country's income and it's the individual income that affects access to men and women alike. And it's a similar picture with education, in that it's income level rather than gender that affects access. That said, when it comes to education, women do consider themselves to be somewhat disadvantaged in their ability to access education. So 53% of respondents think it's easy for most women to get a quality education versus 58% for men. And we do generally see that women place greater value on the importance of education, although it is one of the themes that is universally considered critical to a country's success. So if those two are more about country difference than gender, where we see the gaps between men and women opening up is around various aspects of control and various aspects of representation. And we see women disadvantaged in a number of ways. Put simply, women do not have as much control over their lives as men do. In terms of overall control, 56% of respondents think that most women have control over their lives, while 70% of respondents think that most men have control over their lives. The same sort of pattern applies to financial control, so control over their personal finances, 57% for women against 71% for men. And the same is true in terms of their access to property and ability to buy property, 50% for women, 68% for men. So, and in terms of overall levels of control, we see that disparity emerging. And we also see that women have significantly less say when it comes to some deeply personal decisions, such as who to marry. So 3 in 5, it's 57%, believe that most women in their country do have control over the person that they choose to marry. That's 57% amongst women and 68% amongst men. And it's important, again, I think, here to note the country differences. On the right-hand side, you'll see the percent of women at the top who have control over the decision of who to marry, and the percent of men at the bottom. And it's interesting, I think, here that we see a similar distribution across the countries. So in Colombia, India, Japan, Kenya, it's all actually below average for men and women. So it's important to remember that there are cultural practices and traditions that affect both men and women in these areas. But it's in Nigeria and Turkey in particular where we see quite a marked difference between men and women. So where men have control over this decision, but women don't. So it's an area of distinction anyway, and in those two countries in particular, we see that greater disparity. And whether in marriage or living in partnership, women do start to lose some control over their own bodies. Home is not necessarily a safe place. 53% of women believe that they feel, 53% of respondents think that people feel moderately or very safe in their own home. And men tend to underestimate the impact of this on women. So they don't necessarily understand how frightening and how unsafe the home can be for women. And while domestic violence is not acceptable to the majority of men and women, and it's, I think, very important to point that out, women are still at higher risk of suffering domestic violence. And what I think is particularly troubling here is that 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women believe that it is acceptable to hit a spouse or partner. There are some circumstances where that's acceptable. And I think this highlights really the importance of educating both men and women on this really critical topic. The home brings various responsibilities with it as well, and those responsibilities tend to fall more on women than on men. The welfare of children in particular falls to women. 41% of people agree that the child suffers if the woman works, whereas only 23% agree that the child suffers if the man works. And this is a belief that is held equally by men and women. Again, those traditional norms beginning to show themselves. In Turkey and the UAE, this is very clearly felt to be a female responsibility. And it's only in Kenya and in Sweden where we see the impact being considered equally. So that burden of care really falling more to women. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that that affects women in the workplace. It's harder for women to find skilled work, and both men and women consider women to be more suitable to service roles. And if home isn't, so 43% of respondents think it's easy for a woman to find skilled work versus 55% of men. And if home isn't always a safe place for women, nor is the working environment, there are high levels of agreement that women call attention to themselves by the way that they dress. There is some country variation here, but the agreement is fairly high across all countries, suggesting that this is an ingrained and instilled behavior and attitude in people. And this is carried into the workplace, with 1 in 3 men and 1 in 4 women agreeing that it's acceptable for a man to comment on a woman's appearance at work. And again, an important reminder that there's work to do to change perceptions amongst both women and men in this regard. And these perceptions hold true for gender pay as well, and for equal pay. The gender pay gap has been well documented and discussed. So it will probably come as no surprise that women are likely to be paid less for the same work. 1/3 of men agree that women should be paid less for the same work, as do 1/4 of women. We do see significant variation here by country, with gender wage differentials acceptable only to 10% in the US and 14% in Sweden, but particularly high levels of acceptability in India, Nigeria, the Philippines, and the UAE. And I think it's important to acknowledge here that the personal and the professional play a role. We do also continue to see stigma attached to women earning more than their partner. So 1 in 4 agreeing that a woman should not earn more than her partner. And so that stereotype of the male as the provider is clearly present. And we see a similar country pattern to the previous slide. And the reason I wanted to raise this here is that our personal decisions, of course, and our personal beliefs are, of course, going to influence the decisions that we make in the workplace. And this will get in the way of women rising through an organization. And I'm just going to skip now to a little bit of data from the Reykjavik Index, which Ellie mentioned in her introduction. This is an index that sheds light on society's perceptions and prejudices towards women in leadership. And this reveals here that particularly men, but also women, are uncomfortable with the idea of a female CEO. And so those sorts of beliefs do follow us into the workplace. And so not only do women find it harder to get skilled work in the first place, they're likely to be working in an environment where men are doing the hiring, they're selecting people for promotion, and they're setting salaries. And so women will continue to be held back in the work environment, while men and some women believe that gender wage differentials are acceptable, that a woman shouldn't earn more than her partner, and that women are less suited to leadership. When it comes to gender stereotyping, much responsibility is put on the media and the role that it can play in challenging social norms. And this study reveals that the media is considered to be limited in its portrayal of both men and women. And this learning is borne out in other work that we've done, where we see definite progress in some areas, but an overall lack of progressive portrayals of both women and men. In one of my first slides, I showed that the greatest disparity between men and women was in leadership and participation. We've already seen that men are dominant in the workplace, and the gap is even greater in politics. And there's a fundamental disconnect here, where 78% of people believe that opportunities for women in politics are important to the overall success of the country. Only 35% think it's easy for a woman to run for elected office in their country, compared to 63% for men. So this is the biggest differential we see between men and women in terms of their access to participation. And again, we see this borne out in the Reykjavik Index, where we see that level of discomfort with the idea of a female head of state. And so despite those high levels of agreement that we saw at the beginning of this presentation on the need for equality in all areas, this research does reveal significant discriminatory social norms that will continue to deny women equal access to political participation, to employment, and to have control over their own lives. And I want to finish with a perspective on COVID. Kantar's COVID-19 barometer has been measuring the impact of coronavirus on people around the world. At the beginning of this month, at the beginning of May, 45% of people agreed that their household income had already been impacted by coronavirus. A further 25% of people expected to feel the impact on their household income in the near future. And that number, the households already affected, is already well over 70% in Nigeria, the Philippines, and Kenya. Women will be disproportionately affected by COVID. We estimate another 5 million Nigerians will be pushed into extreme poverty. And in South Africa, we see the millionaires, that is people with little or no money, now making up 70% of the population, and this is skewed towards women and skewed towards people below the age of 34. And in this study, we asked people in times of scarcity, who should take priority? And the response, I'll say that again. We asked people in times of job scarcity, who should take priority? And the response skews towards men. We ask in times of food shortage, who should be given priority? And the response skews towards women. So in times of hardship, we seem to be reverting to traditional roles of man as provider and woman as carer. In a webinar earlier this week, speakers from Google and the Dangote Group said that Africa's biggest crisis is not COVID-19, it's inequality. Thank you. I've taken you through just a few key highlights of the results. I'm sure you can imagine there's a lot more there, and I look forward to your questions, but I will hand over to Ellie.
Thank you, Rosie. That was absolutely fascinating. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sara now, who will lead the fireside chat with Michelle Harrison. Over to you, Sara.
Thanks, Ellie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks so much, Rosie, for distilling such a rich report down into such a short period of time, but it gives us a tantalizing taste as to what can be found in it, because it really is such an important piece of work. So thank you for that. It's my pleasure to join the panel this morning and discuss an important study, as I say, with really fascinating findings. But I think Rosie's observation and indeed our discussion earlier in the week together on early indications of COVID and its impact is a sobering one, that the ongoing crisis isn't COVID, it's inequality, with women disproportionately impacted. And of course, we've known from the beginning that COVID-19 has been a gendered crisis. From the imbalanced burden of care in the home to the fact that women comprise 70% of workers in the health and social sector worldwide, so are more vulnerable to infection. They over-index in service industries where millions have lost their jobs, and domestic violence reports have surged during lockdowns worldwide. So women have been impacted by COVID-19 in ways that will clearly have a knock-on effect for many other equality indicators, or in fact send us backwards. There are huge challenges ahead in terms of regressive gender roles, discrimination, and a reversal of representation that we've collectively fought so hard to achieve. So from an Unstereotype Alliance perspective, we know we have a role to play in this. When advertising and media portray positive and progressive gender roles, we can challenge social norms and discrimination, and particularly these traditional roles that are creeping back in at an alarming pace. We have a unique opportunity in advertising to allow women's voices to be heard and for their needs to be represented, as well as those of boys and men. So now is the time for us to really double down on our efforts. But as ever, there is no cookie cutter approach, and social norms and gender stereotypes are culturally driven. This comes through again and again in the study's findings. So to discuss this, I am delighted to be joined here this morning by my virtual fireside by Dr. Michelle Harrison, who is CEO of Kantar Public. Michelle, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us here. And as Rose has already said, you know, Kantar's so delighted and pleased to be able to make a contribution in this area. So thanks for having us along.
Brilliant, thank you. Michelle, when we're trying to influence attitudes towards gender equality and affect social change in our work, what is the power of evidence-based attitudinal data? How can we use it?
Thank you. So first of all, we would come from a perspective that evidence is essential to any form of policy making anyway, so that anyone who's involved in public policy, just like anyone who's involved in business strategy, they tend to want to have an empirical database to support their thinking, so that they're not just working off anecdote or hunch, but that they've got some clarity about the values and attitudes and patterns in society. Now, if you look at, you know, globally, what we know is there are very good data sets that have demonstrated the outcomes of gender inequality. So whether that's the proportion of women who do get into school or out of school, very basic statistics of access to health, or sophisticated statistics of access to very basic health even. And if we look at the way in which we can observe and get data sets around the number of women in corporate life who've reached senior roles. So we have lots of hard evidence, but one of the things that has been missing, and which I do believe that the work of the Unstereotype Alliance has really contributed to by being able to do this work, is to understand the values and attitudes across society. So they are how people perceive things, but rather than that being soft data, in so many ways, it's the most important data because it helps us understand the conversations and discussions that go on in the household, around the kitchen table, at the community level, that will shape how people, men and women, imagine what their lives can be. So it's those values and attitudes that help us understand both the drivers that shape that kind of hard data of outcome, but also reflect it back to us. And so actually people who work in marketing communications, they tend to be great experts in the use of attitudinal data, but I think it's extremely important to bring it to this area of public policy around gender. And you know, we've been able to do that in Kantar in this work, and also Rosie made a reference to the work we've done with the Women Political Leaders Group and the Reykjavik Index. And again, that's attitudinal data. That's looking at how societies believe the propensity of women, whether or not they're as suitable as men are to lead. And what we have revealed there is the source of some of those prejudices that prevent women reaching equality in leadership positions. So I would say in a world where we have, and have had for some time, very good data around outcomes and gender inequality, this is our ability to really understand some of the factors at the household level, at the community level, at the individual level, that continue to perpetuate bias and inequality.
And it differs, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, marketers are generally very well versed in, you know, hard metrics like brand trackers and consumer demographics. But what does country level or a country specific attitudinal data and research enable us to do? How can that be data? How can that data be used in practice by brands and marketers?
Yeah. So first of all, if we, and I'll come on to the country piece, but if we first of all think, you know, when we look globally, one of the things about gender inequality, as we know, is it's one of those truly wicked social problems that whilst there are quite a lot of variation in attitudes and in outcome statistics at the national country level, globally, we see this as an overwhelming inequality. So if you look, and if we look at it from the point of view of advertising, I was just reminding myself just yesterday of the Gina Davis Institute's research, which was looking at all Cannes Lion winners 2006 to 2016. Men speak 7 times more than women in those adverts. Now that's a driver and a reflection of attitude, right? But if we think about it at the country level and we think about what people in marketing communications can do with that data, so advertising, marketing, brand equity, it plays with ideas of cultural norms. And for the brands that have wanted to participate in the alliance, they've already decided that they wish to be using their communications and marketing ability to challenge social norms in a more progressive way. So what that attitudinal data gives them the ability to do is understand what the norm is and where they can push. And then you take that down to the local level, to the national level, and those very specific cultural elements. It helps marketing and communications leaders to understand what the barriers are they need to overcome, where they might be reaching true levels of discomfort, how they would take a global brand and think about how it might land locally. All the kinds of tools they're very experienced and expert in, but thinking about how their brand and everything that's done around it can continue to support our progress towards less gendered marketing communications.
And can you talk a little bit about the importance of disaggregated data? Why is it so important to understand the tension between men and women and their responses?
So, and we've seen this in the Reykjavik Index data, as well as the data that Rosie's just shared from the work that has been done for UN Women. So if we look overall at gender inequality, we will see that women as well as men absorb and replicate bias in their thinking, that women as well as men believe that women are less equal than men in many areas. We see that from the things that women are held to be responsible for. We also see that women don't believe that women are likely to be as suitable for leadership as men, and they believe that as well. So we're not just dealing with prejudice by men against women, we are dealing with prejudice by society against women. But on every single indicator we've ever looked at, everywhere in the world, that prejudice is held more deeply by men than by women. So what we know is that women are already a little further ahead on the journey to sort of letting go of gender stereotypes. Now, if we don't understand that, we don't understand the tensions that are being experienced inside people's homes, inside people's marriages, inside people's communities and lives. We also don't understand where we have the opportunity to keep pushing to change things. So the need to disaggregate, not just between men and women, but between cultural attitudes and also between demographics and economic issues too. It is all very important to think about the nuances of messaging and how they can help drive a better outcome.
Thank you. Rosie has given some early predictions and indicators between phases 1 and 2 of research, and obviously the great global variable in between those two phases has been COVID-19. So what do you think the impact of COVID-19 will be on gender and gender politics in general?
Thank you. So first of all, I think we have to sort of acknowledge something extraordinary has happened, and we are only just beginning to imagine what the outcome might be. So I think the first thing is we have many danger signs, but it's too soon for us to have absolute clarity. I think secondly, that our research has shown just how badly men as well as women have been hit by this. So some Kantar research that Rosie's already mentioned, you know, the work across the G7 that we did, the last wave being 4 weeks ago, showed that 1 in 8 people across the G7 group, for instance, had lost their income. Whether that's temporary or permanent, we don't yet know. And that's hit men very hard, but it has hit women harder. So we do know that already, and it's everything that you've already said. Women have a greater responsibility for managing the household economy. They have a greater responsibility for caring for children and for elders. They carry greater responsibility around supporting their children's education. They carry a greater responsibility around supporting a family and community health. So overall, we know the burden on them has already been harder. Now, what happens next, I think, is where we start to need to really focus on specific policy areas. And I think there are a number of areas we've got to be really concerned. So some of them are to do with all of those behavioural aspects around outcomes of serious economic hardship, what that can mean, even how it can contribute to issues around domestic violence. So there's that set of the ways in which we have to put in protective policies inside the home and around the economy. I think that there is other research that's now coming through, though, that shows us how we have to be very concerned about the progress that has been made, the undoubted progress that has been made over the last few years, starting to slip away. And there's been some work done by City University in London, which measures, for instance, how many experts, the proportion of men and women in terms of the experts who are commenting in the radio. It's already shown March 2020, a sudden increase in the proportion of experts who were men. And also when it comes into areas like government and politics or the economy, the experts are overwhelmingly men. Some women get sort of get to speak on health or things like that, but we see around the areas that are considered hard, tough, we see the removal of female voices. So I think that's incredibly important. And I think the third area where, an area where Rosie and I have also been active is in the corporate space. There have been, over the last few years, some significant corporate strategies to improve equality between men and women at the board level and in the way we bring women up through the professional pipeline. And when businesses are under stress, this is the moment to really try and protect those principles and priorities, because businesses under stress can easily lose them. So I think I think we don't yet know that this is going to overwhelmingly roll us backwards, but there are so many reasons why we now need to push even harder to maintain what we'd achieved in the last few years as an advocacy group.
And that's
depressing. We've just got to be realistic about how serious this is.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's obviously a shared concern and a frequent conversation at our end, that obviously, you know, we've put such focus and emphasis on diversity and inclusion and progress in that area across all streams of business. And now at a time where, as I say, we should be doubling down on that. In fact, we see it being deprioritized.
Yeah.
And there are so many social impacts of that will be so long lasting. So it's an important time to have these conversations. And I have to say, in terms of female voices, it's been wonderful having two expert female voices in this conversation this morning with yourself and Rosie. So thank you so much for talking with us. I can see we've had a few questions coming in, so I'm going to pause there and hand back to Ellie and see if we can take questions from the floor for yourself and Rosie. But thank you. Thanks. Ellie, back to you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, we have had a few, and I know there were a few issues accessing the chat function. So if you tried before and it didn't work, please do try again. But I have one question here for Rosie from Anne, and that is, what would be the benefits for men as individuals to embrace giving up their beliefs and prejudices on women? What's in it for them beyond losing power and other privileges? So I guess that could be open to all, really. But yes, main question really being around, you know, what's in it for the men? Oh, you're on mute, Rosie.
Thank you. Sorry, it's such an interesting point, and it really speaks to the heart of actually some of the challenge here, because it's the starting point is, what am I giving up, as opposed to what are we gaining as a society. And I think what's very interesting about this research is that when you look at those overall perceptions that I talked about at the very beginning, there is an understanding that an equal society is better for everybody. So when you sort of almost separate it from the individual, there's an understanding that that is the right thing for us to do as a community, as a society. But making that person, or the extent to which that then becomes a personal connection, is really the challenge. So I believe that the understanding's there. The data is telling us that the understanding about a fair society is there, it's understood. What we really need to do through policy, through messaging, though, is to understand how that delivers benefits to everybody, and to have the conversation around the society, the community, and to effectively take it away from the individual. So it's less about me and it's much more about us and the collective.
Yeah, I'd like to also invite Dan as our sole male panelist today to also chime in on that particular question as well, if you don't mind, Dan.
No, absolutely, with pleasure, Ellie. Thank you. And I obviously I very much echo what Rosie said. You know, I'm a man who's worked in gender equality for a while, and sometimes other men can't understand why I'm betraying my sex. So I'm quite used to these discussions. But you know, I think it's absolutely right. It's very clear that you know, a gender equal world is a better world for everyone. If you look at any of the evidence and data, and it's not just in terms of the economics of it, it's in terms of the quality of governance, but it's also in terms of all the things that we care about as men, in terms of the women that are important to us as well. You know, it's enormously distressing for me. You know, I'll just give you a very real, personal, immediate example. You know, my 14-year-old daughter was hesitant to go out yesterday, to just go to the park and walk around, because she doesn't like being catcalled, which is a big problem in the part of Brooklyn I'm in. You know, I don't like that. I would much rather live in a world where that didn't happen. You know, so there's a lot of immediate sort of self-interest arguments for men in terms of what a world where that didn't exist in terms of the treatment of women would look like, and the missed opportunities to leverage the contribution of women would look like. But I think there's also another aspect which we maybe talk about less, and it's difficult to talk about because I think sometimes people get the wrong impression that what you're trying to draw is some form of equivalence between the impacts of gender discrimination on women and men, which is not the point. But the attitudes that we have around masculinity are really not healthy for men. Men kill themselves at a vastly higher rate than women do. Men end up in prison at a vastly higher rate, including for the same crimes than women. And those are all, men are socialized with all sorts of attitudes and beliefs about what they can and can't be and what they can and can't do that are enormously damaging to men as well. And I think sometimes, if we could tell that story about how bad toxic masculinity is for men as well, maybe more men would understand how some of those attitudes that they have, that they're inflicting on each other, really need to change for their benefit too. So we really are all in it together, in my view, in multiple ways. So very much agree with Rosie, and would maybe just add those other perspectives too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. So we've had another question in, and that was, what do you expect to see with the addition of another 10 countries? So obviously, Rosie, you touched on some of the disparity between markets and obviously the similarities as well, but adding another 10 countries into the study, what do you, can you get your crystal ball out for a moment and tell us, what do you expect to see in terms of adding more countries to those trends?
Yeah, well, I know this isn't necessarily about adding more countries, but I think that we've touched on COVID a couple of times now, and I think that's going to be a theme that we're really going to see, obviously, across all of the countries, the original 10 and the other 20. I think what's going to be really interesting, having more countries to work with, is we're going to be able to, I think, cluster markets differently and start to look at some of the, clusters of cultural attitude, for example, and to see what patterns emerge there. At the moment, we're very much looking at either all of the markets together or sort of individually, but I think we'll be able to start to explore different patterns within clusters of markets, which I think will give us some really fascinating insights to some of the underlying sort of cultural practices which underpin the current gender discrimination that we see. So it's a different level of analysis that I think we'll be able to do.
Yeah.
And Elspeth, just if I could come in there, what it should also do, as Rosie said, it gives us that greater geographical understanding, but it will also help brand managers who are working on global brands to better understand the nuances they've got to work around. So it should make it more useful as well for stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Another question we have is, other than influencing policies and practices, what actions can be taken by the public or marketeers, as you've touched on, to help eliminate or start to break down stereotypes? So Michelle, could I pass to you for that small question?
Yes, so that's a big one, isn't it? I think if we get back to this issue of the power of evidence, we can feel very lonely when we think that we are experiencing things and it's just us. Or it can be very difficult as men or as women to understand the experiences we might be having in the workplace, we might be having in education, we might be having in the community. And what this evidence gives us is the ability, all of us as individuals, to understand that wider experience and the cultural drivers that limit us. And all of us as individuals can, I think, get strength from understanding the wider societal issues, and then think about how we can, in our everyday roles, whether that be, as parents, as siblings, as carers in the workplace, can always seek to challenge our underlying thinking. And I think many of us in the workplace, we do that every day. For the people who are part of this program, who are responsible for brands, for communications. You know, we have the evidence now to realize what the impact is of the way in which we push communications out there, and we have the opportunity to challenge ourselves every day. The Women Political Leaders group that we partner with, one of the things I've picked up from them is they often talk about, in terms of the passion for getting more women into political representation, it's very difficult for us to ever be what we don't see. It's very difficult for girls to grow up to be leaders if they don't see women leaders. And I think when we have this evidence, we can understand the challenges. We can also start to demonstrate the progress that we're making. There are reasons for us to feel positive as well as negative as we make that progress. I think anyone who's participating in this call, by definition, we all have some form of, if not organizational influence, but personal efficacy to challenge ourselves, try and make the right choices. Every small step is a giant one when it all comes together. So I think the evidence tells us what we need to do, and I think we all have to do our very best to hold ourselves accountable.
I think just to build on that, I was really quite fascinated by the results around the workplace, and that's one of the areas that Michelle touched on. But I think, you know, any of us who work in, well, really in any environment, you know, we can absolutely influence how the people around us feel. Some of us can influence how we hire and making sure that we have an equal mix of men and women coming up for interview, that we can all make sure that if necessary, we, you know, get women into promotions to push them forward and to make sure that we start to get that gender balance throughout the organization, not just at more junior levels. We can have a say on things like salaries and obviously depending on our level of influence within the organization. But that was an area that really struck me as something that I think, certainly from a personal perspective, I can have some control over. And I think we all have a responsibility to create the environment around us in our home lives, but particularly in the workplace as well, where this data very clearly shows that women aren't necessarily finding their workplace to be safe. They're not necessarily finding it to be an equal and safe space for them. And I think that's an area that we can all influence.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we have a few more practical questions, which I'll just take the opportunity to answer, which is around access to this data. So the full report will be uploaded onto the Unstereotype Alliance website, and we'll notify you as soon as that's up there. So the full findings from today's presentation, that's what will be up. We also been asked a question around when the next wave of data will be available. So we are in field. Rosie, it might be nice to have what's going on.
Yeah, and as you can, I'm sure, all imagine, it's a little bit of a movable feast. So some of the markets, the research is done online, and all of those have been completed. So we do have some of the data for the online markets. As markets have started, or countries have started to come out of COVID and into recovery, we're beginning to be able to start face-to-face field work. And as you can imagine, with many of the countries that we're interviewing in, face-to-face is a really important and really the only methodology that's going to be able to get us to the diversity of people that we want to talk to. So we really do need to wait for the markets to open up before we can begin face-to-face. And we have done face-to-face in a couple of markets that have opened up, Vietnam and the UAE, and actually obviously the priority has been the safety of our interviewers and the respondents, but we've managed to get those done well and sort of in line with what we typically done. But we still have 10 of the markets that haven't yet gone into field, so it's a little bit of a movable feast as to how quickly things open up over the next few months. But the hope is still that we get the field work done within the next 6 weeks or so, and then we'll be able to start looking at the full results from 2020.
Fantastic, thank you. Rosie, earlier on you spoke a bit about what COVID has done to brands and what people are now looking for from those brands, and how that perspective has changed. Would you mind touching briefly on that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so we've seen some differences, particularly differences by age, rather than by country. Generally speaking, people really want to see companies and brands first and foremost looking after staff welfare. So I think as countries went into lockdown, as the severity of the pandemic really struck and people understood what we were dealing with, there was an immediate concern for staff welfare. If businesses are staying open, do they have PPE? If they're not staying open, are people given the provision that they need to work from home? Are they being supported both functionally but also emotionally for that transition? So I think in that first stage of going into lockdown, that was, you know, everybody's focus. As we've seen people sort of settling in, if that's the right term, into, you know, lockdown or their new normal, and the expectation of brands has been varied, and as I've mentioned, varies a little bit by age. So younger respondents in particular expect brands to really step up and play a role in helping government, society to deal with the pandemic. So whether that's donating resources to make hand gel, whether it's making face masks, whether it's donating to donating to vaccines, but they're really expecting brands to step up and play their part in helping us to fight and manage the pandemic. Slightly older, so I suppose the millennials, they're the ones that were hit hardest, soonest in terms of financial impact. So they were really looking for brands to help them out. So give me some price promotions, give me some promotions, give me some ideas that are going to help me to keep my kids occupied while they're working from home, while they're at home and I'm trying to work from home. So I think the millennials in particular were really looking for very practical supports. Just help me to make my life easier while I deal with all of this craziness. And then as we look forward, the focus is on things like supply chain. So, you know, we all felt those few months at the beginning, or those few weeks at the beginning, where maybe brands weren't available to us. And so they're then looking forward to say, you know, what are you doing as a business to make sure that your supply chain is secure? What are you doing as a business to make sure that you can go back to business in a safe environment for your staff and your workforce? So we sort of see this transition as the virus sort of hits, and then people, you know, start to get used to what they're dealing with, and really importantly, start to look ahead to the future.
Great, thank you. I think that'd be incredibly useful for our audience to hear today. So thank you for that. Okay, we have a few minutes left. So before we go ahead and close, I just wanted to check if any participants had any more questions. To go ahead and drop that into the chat function now. And I'm sure there will be plenty more questions coming out as a result of attending this webinar. So we'll be happy to field any further thoughts or queries that come to you after the event as well. So please do send all of those to the Unstereotype Alliance inbox, and we'll do our best to answer those for you. So, okay, there's no more questions coming up into the chat function. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists, and again to Kantar for all of the work that has gone into this study, and for taking the time today to give your views on the study and our current situation. It's been fantastic to have you, and really fascinating thoughts. So thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And if there's any last parting comments from Sara before we let you get on with your day, I'll pass to you quickly now, Sara.
Well, thank you. I just want to echo your thanks, and you know, our relationship with Kantar is a really valuable one, but primarily, you know, I can't wait for us to be able to share this report, because there is just such rich insight. And I know as a as a former and still marketer at heart, there is enormous value to be found in the insights in this report. It's so exciting that we're expanding the number of countries moving forward, because it's a really valuable way to be able to define marketing strategy, to get closer to understanding consumers at a local level. But of course, we know that that's where we can best influence change, is at the grassroots. It's why the Unstereotype Alliance puts such emphasis on our national expansion program, and we look to expand our national chapters. Unfortunately, that is still progressing this year, which we're delighted with that ongoing commitment. So I know that our national chapters will also find this country-specific attitudinal data to be of real value as well as they define their strategies moving forward. So thank you, and we very much look forward to continuing to work closely with Kantar and to sharing these findings with our members as soon as we have that 2020 data available. But keep an eye out for the report. It's really a fabulous piece of work. So thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.